Welcome. The bayonet attack is white's most direct modern challenge to the Mar del Plata King's Indian. We begin with the older kingside race, see how Kramnik changed the evaluation of that battle, and finish with the current a5, knight h5, knight e8, and c6 systems. d4. White controls e5 and c5 and prepares a broad pawn center. Knight f6. Black attacks e4 and waits before choosing a central pawn break. c4. White controls d5 and creates the pawn that will later advance to c5. g6. Black prepares the dark squared bishop for the long diagonal. Knight c3. White develops and prepares to occupy the center with e4. Bishop g7. The bishop is blocked for now, but it will become powerful if the center opens. e4. White gains space and fixes e4 as black's long-term target. d6. Black prevents an easy e5 advance and prepares the central break with e5. Knight f3. White supports e5 and d4 and prepares to castle. Castles. Black places the king safely before challenging the center. Bishop e2. White chooses the classical development and keeps the queen free to support the center. e5. Black challenges d4 and invites white to close the center. Castles. White secures the king before the center becomes fixed. Knight c6. Black adds pressure to d4 and prepares to reroute after d5. d5. White gains space and creates the locked pawn chain that defines the Mar del Plata. Knight e7. Black clears c6 and prepares to move the f6 knight before advancing the f-pawn. b4. White starts queenside play immediately and keeps the f3 knight ready for knight g5 to e6. White wants c5, b5, pressure on d6, and sometimes bishop a3. Black can accelerate with knight h5, restrain the queenside with a5, retreat with knight e8, or strike at the center with c6. The bayonet is not a simple opposite wing race because both sides may switch fronts. Knight h5. Black clears f6 for the f-pawn and aims to place the knight on f4. Rook e1. White protects e4 and prepares bishop f1 if the knight enters f4. Knight f4. Black gains an advanced outpost, but the knight also stands in front of the f-pawn. Bishop f1. White protects the king, eyes h3, and prepares to exchange the f4 knight when useful. a5. Black attacks b4 before white can advance b5. B takes a5. White accepts the structural change and gives black an active rook file. Rook takes a5. Black activates the rook and keeps pressure on white's a-pawn. Knight d2. White reroutes towards c4 and supports the queenside dark squares. c5. Black blocks the c-pawn and hopes to keep white's attack sealed. a4. White fixes the rook's path and prepares to use the a-file with pieces rather than pawns. Rook a6. Black keeps the rook active and protects the 6th rank. Pause the video. White's a-rook appears trapped behind its own pawn, but one move turns it into both a queenside attacker and a kingside defender. Find Kramnik's move. Rook a3. The rook attacks from the queenside and can swing to g3 or h3 to defend the king. g5. Black gains kingside space and prepares to chase the f3 knight. g3. White attacks the f4 knight and creates a retreat square for the king. Knight h3 check. Black uses the outpost tactically before it disappears. Bishop takes h3. White eliminates the advanced knight and reduces the kingside force. Bishop takes h3. Black keeps an active bishop near the king, but gives up the long diagonal. Queen h5. White hits h3 and g5 while coordinating with the third-rank rook. Queen d7. Black protects g4 and prepares to support the kingside pawns. Queen takes g5. White removes the leading attacker and shows that the kingside race has failed. Kramnik's win over Kasparov at Novgorod in 1997 showed the weakness of a routine knight f4 attack. The knight blocked the f-pawn, white defended from the third rank, and black could not open the queenside or center. Modern black play became less automatic and more multi-front. Rewind to the position after 9b4. Before the serious modern systems, remove one slow reaction from black's repertoire. Knight d7 allows white to execute the central break immediately. Knight d7. Black prepares f5 but does nothing to restrain the queenside. c5. White attacks d6 before black has created a counter threat. D takes c5. Black gives up the d6 anchor to remove white's advanced pawn. B takes c5. White creates a protected passer and opens b4 for a piece. Knight takes c5. Black wins the advanced pawn but places the knight on a tactical square. Bishop a3. White attacks the knight and the d6 complex while completing development. Return to the position after 9b4. Knight e8 keeps the knight away from a queenside tempo and supports f5, but white can place the c-pawn on c5 before the kingside attack begins. Knight e8. Black supports f5 and keeps h5 free, but concedes space. c5. White fixes d6 as a target and gains queenside territory. f5. Black attacks e4 and begins kingside play before white consolidates c5. First examine knight g5. White aims for e6 and the dark squared bishop. h6. Black forces the knight to commit and creates luft, but weakens the kingside. Knight e6. White attacks c7, f8, and g7 from the protected outpost. Bishop takes e6. Black removes the outpost before it becomes permanent. D takes e6. White gains a protected pawn that divides black's position, while black receives targets and an open f-file. Rewind to the position after 10 f5. The positional main line keeps the structure intact and routes the knight to c4, where d6 becomes a permanent target. Knight d2. White supports c4 and keeps the kingside pawns ready to reinforce e4. Knight f6. Black attacks e4 and supports the kingside pieces. f3. White protects e4 and prevents the f-pawn from opening the center cleanly. f4. Black fixes the kingside and prepares g5, but closes the f-file for the moment. Knight c4. White attacks d6 and supports a4, bishop a3, and b5. Black must create threats before this knight dominates the queenside. Return to black's ninth move. Instead of racing on either wing, black can attack d5 with c6. This asks whether the b-pawn advance helped white defend the center. c6. Black challenges d5 and prepares to open the g7 bishop. a4. White prepares to answer a5 without allowing the queenside to be frozen. a5. Black attacks b4 and creates a tactical file for the queen. B takes a5. White releases the tension before black captures on b4. Queen takes a5. Black activates the queen, attacks c3, and keeps pressure on d5. Rook a3. White protects the queenside and prepares to transfer the rook toward the king if needed. Return to the position after 9b4. Recent practice treats a5 as black's most coherent practical answer. It challenges the bayonet immediately and forces white to solve an a-file tactic before pursuing the attack. a5. Black attacks b4 and makes the a-file tactically important. First examine a3. White tries to protect b4 with another pawn, but overlooks the rook on a1. A takes b4. Black forces the a-pawn to recapture and opens a direct line toward the rook. A takes b4. White restores the pawn chain but leaves the a1 rook exposed. Rook takes a1. White cannot recapture, and black wins an exchange. This tactic explains why white needs bishop a3 or b takes a5. Rewind to the position after 9 a5. Capturing on a5 avoids the pin and was the historical main reply. Modern black play inserts a central move before recovering the pawn. B takes a5. White opens the a-file and tries to make the a-pawn a long-term target. c5. Black changes the pawn structure before recovering a5 and secures the c5 square. a4. White keeps the a-pawn chain intact and gains space. Rook takes a5. Black regains the pawn and keeps a stable c5 barrier. Rook a3. White no longer expects a quick pawn breakthrough and instead uses piece activity and third-rank defense. Knight e8. Black supports f5 while keeping the queenside structure closed. Rewind to the position after 9 a5. Modern white theory prefers bishop a3. The bishop develops, makes d6 a target, and prepares to recapture on b4 without opening the a-file against the rook. Bishop a3. White develops with pressure on d6 and prepares to meet a takes b4 with the bishop. A takes b4. Black removes the bayonet pawn and asks the bishop to commit. Bishop takes b4. White restores material, controls d6, and keeps the a-rook protected. Before the main line, examine b6. Black covers a5 and prepares to challenge the center with c5. a4. White prepares a5 and fixes queenside targets. Rook e8. Black reinforces e5 and prepares to answer a queenside break centrally. a5. White gains space but gives black a chance to strike at c4. c5. Black attacks d4's former chain and prepares to exchange the advanced pawns. D takes c6. White wins the d6 pawn but exposes the a5 pawn and central squares. Knight takes c6. Black develops with tempo against a5 and gains active compensation for the pawn. Rewind to the position after 11 bishop takes b4. A major modern insight is that black does not always need to stop c5. Black can allow the break and answer by attacking white's center. Rook e8. Black supports e5 and prepares a central answer to white's thematic advance. c5. White attacks d6 and tries to open the queenside before black develops. D takes c5. Black removes the advanced pawn and opens the d-file. Bishop takes c5. White regains the pawn and attacks e7, but the d5 pawn is now exposed. Pause the video. White appears to have achieved everything: an active bishop, queenside space, and pressure on e7. Find the central move that attacks the d5 chain and releases black's pieces. c6. Black challenges d5, opens routes for the queen and bishop, and proves that a wing break can be met in the center. Rewind to the position after 11 bishop takes b4. Your supplied line begins with knight bd7. The knight restrains c5 and prepares f5, but black must first solve a tactical problem with the light-squared bishop. Knight bd7. Black adds control of c5 and prepares the kingside break. a4. White prepares to fix the queenside before black creates kingside threats. First examine f5. Black attacks e4 immediately but leaves the e6 and h7 squares vulnerable. Knight g5. White attacks e6 and h7 and prepares to enter e6 with tempo. Rewind to the position after 12 a4. Black should move the bishop before pushing the f-pawn. This small improvement makes the kingside break tactically sound. Bishop h6. Black removes the bishop from the queenside congestion and reduces the force of knight g5. a5. White cramps b6 and preserves space for a later c5 break. f5. With the bishop improved, black attacks e4 and begins counterplay. Knight d2. White supports the c-pawn and prepares to meet the kingside attack without abandoning the queenside. Knight f6. Black pressures e4 and coordinates the kingside pieces. c5. White attacks d6 only after fixing a5 and improving the pieces. Bishop takes d2. Black eliminates the piece supporting c4 and reduces white's queenside coordination. Queen takes d2. White keeps the bishop here and connects the queen to d6. F takes e4. Black uses the moment to remove white's central anchor and open the f-file. C takes d6. White removes black's backward pawn and creates a passed pawn for one move. C takes d6. Black recaptures and reaches a dynamic position. White has the bishop pair and queenside space, black has central activity and kingside counterplay. Rewind to the position after 9b4. Knight h5 remains fully playable, but it demands more exact theory than a5. White has several serious 10th moves, so we examine the alternatives before the selected main line. Knight h5. Black clears f6 for the f-pawn and keeps pressure on f4. First examine g3. White stops the knight from settling on f4 and builds a dark square shelter. f5. Black uses the gain tempo to challenge e4. Knight g5. White attacks e6 and prepares to trade the g7 bishop. Knight f6. Black protects h7 and contests e4 while the g-pawn move limits white's bishop. Rewind to the position after 9 knight h5. White can also play c5 immediately, accepting a direct race between the d6 target and black's kingside attack. c5. White fixes d6 as a target before defending the center. f5. Black attacks e4 and refuses to defend passively. Knight d2. White prepares knight c4 and supports the queenside chain. Knight f6. Black attacks e4 and makes the central structure a tactical issue. f3. White maintains the pawn chain and prepares to meet f4. f4. Black closes the f-file and prepares a pawn storm while white builds on the queenside. Rewind to the position after 9 knight h5. Rook e1 is the most principled main move because it protects e4, prepares bishop f1, and lets the f3 knight move without dropping the center. Rook e1. White reinforces e4 and prepares to answer the kingside attack with active piece play. Before the forcing main line, examine a5. Black restrains the queenside before committing the f-pawn. B takes a5. White releases the queenside tension. Rook takes a5. Black activates the rook and fixes white's a-pawn. a4. White prevents the rook from settling comfortably and prepares a5. h6. Black prevents knight g5 before advancing the f-pawn, but permanently loosens the king shelter. Rewind to the position after 10 rook e1. The direct main line is f5. White should not defend passively, the f3 knight uses the square that the bayonet deliberately preserved. f5. Black attacks the center and prepares f4 if white waits. Knight g5. White attacks e6, eyes h7, and prepares to exchange black's best bishop. First examine knight f4. Black places the knight aggressively and accepts structural complications. Bishop takes f4. White eliminates the attacker before it settles. E takes f4. Black gains the bishop pair and opens the e-file, but accepts doubled f-pawns. Rook c1. White supports c5 and places the rook opposite c7. Bishop f6. Black develops with pressure on g5 and c3. Knight e6. White creates a protected outpost and attacks c7 and f8. Bishop takes e6. Black gives up the king's Indian bishop to eliminate the knight. D takes e6. White gains a protected passed pawn and opens the d file. Bishop takes c3. Black eliminates the piece that supports d5 and b5. Rook takes c3. White activates the rook on the third rank and keeps pressure on c7. F takes e4. Black attacks the center and creates practical play against the exposed pawns. Rewind to the position after 11 knight g5. The main repair is the paradoxical return to f6. Black has induced the knight to g5 and can now challenge the center with c6. Knight f6. Black protects h7, attacks e4, and keeps the f-pawn free to advance. First examine f3. White protects e4 and keeps the light-squared bishop flexible. King h8. Black prepares to meet knight e6 without tactical checks on the diagonal. Knight e6. White attacks the dark-squared bishop and creates central pressure. Bishop takes e6. Black removes the knight before it can dominate c7 and f8. D takes e6. White keeps a protected pawn on e6 and opens the d file. F takes e4. Black opens the f file and makes the e6 pawn a future target. Rewind to the position after 11 knight f6. Bishop f3 is the more active modern choice. White reinforces e4 and keeps the f-pawn flexible, while black must strike at d5. Bishop f3. White supports e4, watches b7, and keeps f3 available only if needed. c6. Black challenges the pawn chain before white completes the queenside breakthrough. Before the forcing main line, examine bishop b2. White preserves the bishop and reinforces the long diagonal. C takes d5. Black challenges white's space before the bishop can support a queenside breakthrough. E takes d5. White keeps the c-pawn ready for c5 and opens the e-file. e4. Black attacks the f3 bishop and fixes a central space gain. Bishop e2. White preserves the bishop and prepares to use c5 against black's d6 pawn. Rewind to the position after 12 c6. Bishop e3 allows the most forcing modern sequence. Black exchanges the d5 chain, and both sides must understand the resulting central transformation. Bishop e3. White supports d4's former chain and prepares queen d2 while keeping pressure on a7. C takes d5. Black removes the head of white's space chain before it can advance. C takes d5. White keeps the e-pawn mobile and preserves the e6 outpost. h6. Black forces the g5 knight to occupy e6 before exchanging it. Knight e6. White attacks the bishop and c7 from the protected square. Bishop takes e6. Black removes the outpost and prepares to attack the new pawn. D takes e6. White gains a protected passed pawn and opens the d file. Knight takes e4. Black uses the newly opened diagonal and attacks white's central support. Knight takes e4. White accepts the exchange and keeps the e6 pawn for the moment. F takes e4. Black restores material and opens lines toward white's king. Bishop takes e4. White eliminates the advanced pawn and centralizes the bishop. d5. Black gains time on the bishop and establishes connected central pawns. Bishop c2. White keeps the bishop pair and eyes the king side. The result is a dynamically balanced middle game rather than a forced attack for either side. Pause and name the assets, not the evaluation. White has the bishop pair, an active light squared bishop, and queenside space. Black has a mobile center, open kingside lines, and targets created by the earlier e6 wedge. The next correct move depends on which side improves the least active piece first. The history of the bayonet is the history of switching fronts. Korchnoi made the early queenside advance serious. Kramnik showed that rook a3 could attack and defend while the old knight f4 plan ran out of targets. Modern black play answers with restraint on a5, central resistance with c6 or c5, and only then the kingside break. For white, remember bishop a3, c5, knight g5 to e6, and the third rank rook. For black, challenge the center before white's space becomes permanent.